There we go. All right, so we're continuing on today. I have a couple goals. One is to continue on through the perspective of the photographers, their experiences, and some of the pictures they've taken. I then am going to sort of step out of what I've been doing, and I want to look at something that really is pertinent to today's world. How is it? And it applies to Russia, not just Germany, but how is it that the bystander was able to be a bystander? What does it mean not to do anything? How do you justify that? Where does that come from? What are the factors that lead one to do that? And then we'll finish up with the Black Book at the end of the class. Those are my three goals for today. And I believe next week we go on to Khrushchev. All right. So the published and the archival records show that although editors were not publicizing the enormity of Auschwitz when it was discovered, the photographers were taking pictures, and the images of Auschwitz were profoundly different from those of Majdanek. You find the formulaic, and it's so tragic to be able to say that, but you find the formulaic images of barracks and barbed wire and corpses. Let me just let Jerry in. And corpses, but the photographs of Auschwitz show something that the other camps in general did not, and that is survivors. All right. While the others, when others were discovered, you found a couple dozen survivors. At Auschwitz, they found more than 7,000. It was a brand new element in terms of people trying to make sense of what had happened. First question is, how does somebody even survive? People are now looking at this and saying, it's like someone in a plane crash. Two people walk away and your mind goes, how is that even possible? And then more importantly, how do you determine who is a survivor and worthy of sympathy? Who's a bystander? Or worse, who was a collaborator in the process? Right? Figuring out how to categorize those people who now remain behind is a brand new issue, because now we have survivors for the first time. In the materials, you'll see there's a picture there of the entrance to Auschwitz. Okay, and you have the sign Arbach Machai. It's the iconic gates that we know of that led to Auschwitz I. This is when you think of Auschwitz, this is the picture that you automatically go to in your minds. However, it's important to note that most Jewish victims of Auschwitz never entered through these gates. They instead came in on the trains that went into Birkenau I, and what you've got here, all right, is an attempt in the pictures to again universalize the experience of the Holocaust instead of Judaizing the experience. Jews and those who were being put in the camps did not come in this way. Who went in this way? The workers. Who went in this way? The people who happened to come into the camp to do different things from the community. This was not the gate of entry for Jews and those being persecuted. And so in and of itself, it's an example of the universalizing of the experience of the camps. This tension, and we've talked about this a bunch, between the poles of universalism and the stark reminders of particularism shaped the photographers and the photography throughout the war. They're being pressured by the government to do things in certain ways. Again, we're talking about the Soviet photographers. Ilya Ehrenberg wrote about this and how it was impacting him, and that was reading number 1. So Diane, you've got the first square. Do you have it? It should say Ilya Ehrenberg, but you're muted.
Yeah, it says reading number 7.
All right, so yeah, there you go. Okay.
So
There we go. I grew up in a Russian city. My mother tongue is Russian. I am a Russian writer. Like all Russians, I am now defending my homeland. But the Nazis have reminded me of something else. My mother's name was Hannah. I am a Jew. I say this proudly. Hitler hates us more than anyone else.
You can see this with, in America too, with the vast majority, a significant number of Jews who really identify as Jewish, but it's not part of their identity. And suddenly anti-Semitism comes along and their identity is reinforced. That's what he's describing. Bergelson gave a speech in Yiddish in 1941 titled, "I Will Not Die, But Will Live." And that's, you may not recognize it, but it's right out of the Psalms that we use on Hallel, Lo Amud Ki Ehyeh from Psalms. He's wrestling with the tensions between the universal and all that goes into the particularism of being a Jew. He says it is Hitler's plan to wipe out all the peoples, in the first place, the Jewish people. So the first thing he's saying is, you all know the sort of the poem of they came for this group first, but I wasn't one of them. And then they came for this group and I wasn't, but finally they came for me. He's saying, by sitting back in this situation, you're next. Okay. At the same time, he's reminding his Jewish listeners that under this New World Order, being a Jewish secularist isn't going to save them. He says the bandit Hitler makes no distinction between workers and manufacturers, between free thinkers and religious people, between assimilated and unassimilated Jews. You're not going to be able to hide behind your secularism. So on the one hand, he's talking to the Jewish people. On the other hand, he's speaking to the larger population and saying, you better step in because it's going to come your way soon. In general, the Russian language press, and again, he's writing in Yiddish. The Russian language press tells universal stories about Nazi atrocities, subtly incorporating the fact that Jews may have been the primary victims. Jews are telling their different story, and as I mentioned, primarily in Yiddish. And if you look at the wartime Soviet record in Yiddish in particular, alongside of the photographs and the excerpts from diaries and other materials, you'll see that all of these writers, that all of these photographers are struggling with what does it mean to be a Jew in Russia during these tragic times? What does it mean? We also learn, to a large extent, that some things could be said in Yiddish that could not be said in Russian. Okay. A third writer, Markish, tells his readers that the Soviet Union is up against an enemy with an irrational fear and hatred of Jews. Talk about an understatement, okay? But certainly he's identifying this reality. It was a fear, as he describes, based on Jewish power. So the Germans are selling the Jewish power as their argument. The Nazis' fear of Jewish power is almost ironic in a wartime climate in Russia, in which others are now falsely accusing Jews of shirking their war duties, and they use the phrase they're fighting on the Tashkent, T-A-S-H, Kent, K-E-N-T, Tashkent front. The city of Tashkent is perceived as a symbolically Jewish city, but in a very negative way. Most Soviet citizens, including Jews, lived for part of the war in evacuation places like Tashkent. That's where they ran to, they hid, they fled. And the anti-Semitic joke was that Jews share their war duties by hiding out in evacuation, fighting on the Tashkent front where there is no fighting. So the presumption is Jews evacuated, they fled to the front. From the front, they were hiding out, waiting for the war to end and for the Russians to save them. In reality, though, Jews served it as a much higher percentage of their rate of percentage in the population. They were serving on it. Nonetheless, what you have here is you've got the Germans imagining this Jewish power coming out of Russia in particular. And therefore, that's their target. Jews are causing this. At the same time, in Russia, the Jews are being denigrated for their lack of power and their lack of interest and their lack of participation. August 1943, the first war crimes trial is taking place in Russia, and the same writer, Markish, publishes what is his most powerful poetic essay, of the war, and it's written, as he writes, to the Jewish warrior. And that's reading number 2. Manny, you want to do that?
Sure. The Markish one?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay,
Reading number 8.
thank you. I know you kissed your rifle on the day when the life of the nation hung in the balance, and with each shot, as if accompanied by a thundering bell's chime, you blessed the land that gave that rifle to you. You made a fiery vow with fire and with blood through uprising and through pain. You, the Jew, the citizen, the partisan, the Red Army soldier.
Right. He's writing to the soldier. Jews were absolutely involved in this war, despite the Soviet attempt to claim otherwise. And you can imagine for the Jews fighting to hear all this is cause for a lot of aggravation, a lot of anger. And so in another section of the same poem, Markish invokes the 4 forms of capital punishment in the Torah that show the revenge killing of those who committed atrocities against Jews. He says the revenge killings against the Nazis is divinely sanctified. He's using the Torah to justify the response to the Nazis. He says, hear what is crying out from all directions, vengeance. Now, you may like that or not like it, but those are his words, okay? He turns to the enigmatic story of Simeon and Levi in the Bible, the Israelite avengers. Let me remind you of this story. In chapter 34 of Genesis, the 12 brothers, their sister Dinah is raped by Shechem. Now, Shechem, the character, also happens to live in the city of Shechem. So something's wrong, clearly. Something is wrong in the story, but that's the way the Bible describes it. And as a result, the 2 brothers organize a plot. The Shechem and his family come and they say, we want to marry Dinah. We want to merge our 2 communities together. And so what Simeon and Levi say to them is that if you and all of your community, the males, will be circumcised, we'll agree to this. And while they're writhing in pain and laying in bed after the surgery, Simeon and Levi go in and kill all of them. All right. The Bible's verdict on this is clear because in chapter 49, 15 chapters later, when Jacob is talking about the brothers on his deathbed, he condemns them for what they've done. But Markish, on the same time, is using this as an example of how one responds. And he says, I do not forget how Simeon and Levi slaughtered Shechem for defiling and raping their sister. So even though the Bible's ultimate verdict, chapters later, is negative, he's using it as an example of what should be done here. He then opens a section in his poem in which he asserts it was the Germans and only the Germans who did this. And he's damning the entire German nation. On one hand, what he's trying to do is say, let's not distinguish between Hitlerites and Germans. They're all guilty here. They all know what's going on. They're all tolerating what's going on. On the other hand, despite that, he's also potentially exonerating the Nazi collaborators, so the Ukrainians and others, and it's a political strategy that's becoming more important in the Soviet Union because what they want to do is rebuild the family of Soviet nations. Okay? They want to defend the Ukrainians. And so on the one hand, he's accomplishing both of these goals in this one statement. All the Germans are guilty, and at the same time, the others, well, we're going to re-embrace them and welcome them back in. He's also, in this process, changing the way that he addresses the Jewish reading audience. In one poignant passage, he questions the culpability of the entire German nation and tells Jews that they need to start seeing their loss as something bigger than themselves. He acknowledges the need for vengeance, that's what he said earlier, but he also wants Jewish readership not to turn that into parochialism. He wants to keep it universal. Now, mind you, this is a shift in his writing from his earlier stages. In earlier times, he was against universalism. But the war is coming to an end, and the rising Soviet state is suspicious of all Jewish national expression. So you see in his writings the pressure that's being applied to him by the national government, and so he's tempering his Jewish national voice. He's worried that too much Jewish nationalism ultimately will be harmful to the Jews' own self-interest in Russia. And so he's starting to shape his message differently. He calls on them to see the mass murder of the European brothers and sisters as a problem for humanity, not just Jews alone, both for ideological and, as I've described, very practical purposes as well. Comments, thoughts? We live in a country where theoretically none of this happens, and we're very blessed. At the same time, everybody has their political bend. All right. But the good news is you can shift from one channel to another and get alternative viewpoints. I think in a sense, I actually would recommend people do that periodically. It's very easy to just see your perspective. And I happen to be a Democrat, but I do turn on Fox News occasionally to get a sense of what is it they're saying, assuming they're not idiots. What is it? What's their point and what's their understanding? How do they make sense of the, all right? And so I think it's important to do that. That's not happening in Russia. So right off the bat, that's something to be very appreciative of here in America. All right. I want to shift. I have a book here that I read I was, so let's see, 22, 19, right, I think it was 1981. I was in a class. It's a book by Milton Mayer called They Thought They Were Free. The first thing is you can see the cover, and I have a horrible story. I'm driving down, my first job as a cantor in Nanuet, New York, and I'm driving, I have this on the front seat, and I see somebody pull up, they see my kippah on the head, and they see this, and it's like, oh my God. So from that point on, I always had something covering it. But what he does in this book is describe, he goes back to Germany after the war, and he interviews 10 relatively normal people in German society in a little town called Kronenberg, who are not involved in necessarily any of the killings or the persecutions, but they understood what was going on, which is a lot of people in the German society. And he's trying to understand from a psychological perspective, what were the causes that enable somebody to sit still and watch all this happen? And what we're going to do is we're going to do a number of readings, and you're going to see it's not quite as clear-cut as we'd like it to be. We might make the very same choices, particularly if you're not aware of the pressures upon you. That's why I think it's an important conversation. All right, reading number 9. Sandy, you're up.
The Jews were never entirely wiped out in Egypt, in Rome.
Oh, wait. No. It should say limited outside contact. I'm sorry, my bad.
I don't have that in mind.
You don't have limited, they thought they were free?
No.
Yeah, I added it after. All right, I'm going to do the readings. I apologize. My bad. I added it after I did the initial stuff last fall. All right. So this is all from this one book, reading number 9. None of these 9 Germans had ever traveled abroad. None had ever known or talked with a foreigner or read the foreign press. None wanted to listen to the foreign radio when it was legal to do so, and none listened to it when it was illegal. So the first factor is, what's the information you're receiving? All right. If we're at war, on 9/11, after 9/11, we were not listening to Arab news. Okay, we were getting the news as filtered through the lens that we trust. All right. And so if you're not going to listen to the Arab news when things are calm, you're certainly not going to turn there when you're at war with them. And so they control their information, which is another reason why I said make sure you watch the other perspectives on the news as well. Okay? So limited outside contact. Next reading. Hitlerism had to answer communism with something just as radical. Communism always used force. Hitlerism answered it with force. The really absolute enemy of communism, always clear, always strong in the popular mind, was National Socialism, the only enemy that answered communism in kind. If you wanted to save Germany from communism, to be sure of doing it, you went to National Socialism. The Nazi slogan in 1932 was, if you want your country to go Bolshevik, vote communist. If you want to remain free Germans, vote Nazi. So the second element that's at play here is this is not operating in a vacuum. Oftentimes, we pick between the least of two evils. Sometimes it's your only choice. And if you read about the Pope in World War II, almost every support of the Nazis, as he describes it, as is described, is in response to his fear of the anti-God nature of communism. It's not, I'm not going to tell you he was a Jew lover, but it's not necessarily driven by anti-Semitism. It was driven by anti-communism. It's an important distinction. Again, apply these to the world in which we live as we're going. Third, men think of the lives they lead and the things that they see, particularly sights which meet them in their daily rounds. There were jobs and job security, summer camps for the children, and Hitlerjugend to keep them off the street. What does a mother want to know? She wants to know where her children are and with whom and what they're doing. In those days, she did or thought she did. What difference does it make between? So things went better at home, and when things go better at home and on the job, what more does a husband and father want to know? Keep it in its times in terms of the gender issues, okay? In Cronenberg, nobody went cold. Nobody went hungry. Nobody went ill and uncared for. For whom do men know? They know people of their own neighborhood, of their own station and occupation, of their own political views, of their own religion and race. Men joined the Nazi Party to get a job, or to hold a job, or to get a better job, or to save themselves from getting a worse job, or to get a contract, or to hold a contract, a customer, a client, a patient. So economics drive a lot of our decisions. That's why I'm absolutely convinced no one should ever vote on economic causes. That should be the last thing, because under that rubric, almost anything else can be hidden. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing is, if you think about it, most of our experiences in a big city like Houston is very neighborhood oriented. We know the restaurants in our neighborhood. We know the community in our neighborhood. How often do any of us go to East Houston or to North? I mean, we may periodically venture out, but that's cars, and those worlds they didn't at all. And even for us, it's limited. So you know what's going on in your neighborhood. You know the people in your neighborhood. You don't want to be. You don't know anything about the other groups. You become very church-based. We have a synagogue base. We know the people in the synagogue. That's our functions within our own groups. Issue number four, don't get involved. There's some sort of trouble on the streets of Cronenberg, as one or another of my friends was passing by on a number of occasions, but the police dispersed the crowd and there was nothing in the local newspaper. You and I leave some sort of troubles on the streets to the people in charge. So did my friends in Cronenberg. How nearly impossible it is to escape once a man has come into conflict with the police. Better far if you ever before you come into contact with them, instead to never come into contact with them. And if you do so, do it on their side as a supporter. Best of all, never come into contact. Don't see the dog beating on the street, or the wife beating, or the Jew beating, or anything. You have your own struggles. All right, so when you drive by and you see the police have stopped someone, what's your assumption? They must have done something. Your instinct is that the police are correcting a problem. All right. You don't get involved for lots of reasons. One, you assume the guilt or the potential guilt. And two, as I said, you don't want to be on some list the police are checking into on a regular basis. Nobody does. I'm not suggesting anything us are doing criminal things, but let's not even raise the possibility of having them look in our direction. Okay, so that's the fourth issue. 5, stigmatization. Ordinary people, ordinary Germans, cannot be expected to tolerate activities which outrage the ordinary sense of ordinary decency unless the victims in advance are successfully stigmatized as enemies of the people, of the nation, the race, the religion. The Germans' innocuous acceptance and practice of social anti-Semitism before Hitler had undermined the resistance of their ordinary decency to the stigmatizations and the persecutions to come. We, you and I, want the community's approval on the community's basis. We don't want the approval of criminals. The community, however, is the one who decides what is criminal. How many of you will go out and hang out in the jail and look for friends? I'm guessing none. Okay. The reality of it is that's not our peer group. That's not whose approval we're looking for. And if you have years of stigmatization, even before this process begins, they've already been defined in your head as at least potentially guilty. That's the danger in America of all the anti-Black kinds of things that we see on television. As our minds shift of that's a possibility, that's a possibility, if someone were to come along, we might buy in. That's the danger of anti-Semitism as it exists in America. That's whatever the group is, that's the danger of these kinds of things that if someone comes along, they've already been pre-stigmatized in our heads, and we're more likely to believe, yes, they're guilty, and therefore to stand by. And last, and then I'm going to open it up for comments. Just don't do anything. Anti-Nazis, no less than Nazis, let the rumors pass, if not rejecting them, certainly not accepting them. Either they were enemy propaganda, well, they certainly sounded like enemy propaganda, and with one's country fighting for its life and one's sons and brothers dying for the cause, who wants to hear, or even still less, repeat what sounds like enemy propaganda? The German community had nothing to do other than not to interfere, do nothing. Absolutely nothing was expected of them except to go on as they had, paying their taxes, reading their local papers, listening to the radios, and going on with their jobs and their lives, which are far improved. In other words, live normal lives. Now, I want to ask this question on 2 levels. Can you understand how they didn't respond? And 2, can you understand what it is you need to do to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen here, that we don't become bystanders? And I open the floor. It's not a theoretical question. Yeah.
I think I can understand better why they stood by. Also, it was in the character of the German people to follow authority. They tended to be, and maybe this is terrible overgeneralization, They tended to view the whoever was the government was right. For them, for most of them, coming after the loss of World War One, the reparation payments that created even a greater burden, the Depression, etc. For most of them, just life was better. We're no longer need soup lines. We've got good jobs. I saw a blurb, and I can't remember the name of the movie that recently came out about the family of a guard in one of the concentration camps who lived very close by, and the wife was thrilled because she had a beautiful house. What they knew or didn't know, what they wanted not to know, is just they're measured by, look, our lives are better than they were before. If you stigmatize people, I will say when I was trying to avoid going to Vietnam, I was in ROTC in the summer camp, and everyone referred to the Vietnamese as gooks. It was the gooks. Well,
Yeah.
if you repeat enough times the word gook, it's easier to shoot a gook than a person.
Yep.
And so you depersonalize it. And I think I understand why most people just said we shouldn't mix in. This is just the way it is. I also recall reading several years ago how, at least in the early part of the Nazis, the English upper class were more than willing to forgive the Nazis for what they were doing because they were the bulwark against communism. And again, communism will directly affect our lives. We're not Jewish. All this stuff is not going to affect our lives.
Right. Not happening in a vacuum. Yep.
Yeah.
I love what you've said. I'm going to come back, however, to the issue of authority at the end, but I want to hear other comments. Anybody else? Okay. The authority question, I think that there's a general assumption that indeed the Germans were unique in their response to authority figures. And I'm going to suggest that may not, that's very comfortable, because that means somehow they're different from me, and therefore I wouldn't do. That was the premise of the Stanley Milgram experiments in the 1950s. Anybody here know of the Milgram experiments? All right, then I'll go through them. Milgram was a social scientist who, in the 1950s, was convinced that Americans wouldn't behave as Germans do to authority figures. That was his premise. All right. And he set up a system in which two people would come into an office. One would be randomly, one would be assigned a student role, one would be assigned a teacher role. All right. Milgram himself is set up in a lab coat, and it's happening at Yale University. So it has all the trappings of a real educational experiment. He's wearing the right authority uniform, etc. And the goal, the experiment was to see how far what the teacher would do if the student kept getting wrong answers. The teacher is shown, he's given a 60-volt shock, and he sees that hurts. They are then separated. The student goes into one room, the teacher goes into another room, and he's given a number of paired choices. So it says red, fire engine. It said he has to memorize this list. And then he said red and 4 choices. And the student's job is on a machine to push A, B, C, or D. Fair? Everybody got that? The teacher's job is to, if he gets the wrong answer, to administer a shock starting at 15, and with each incorrect answer to increase it in intervals of 15 volts. On the machine, it goes all the way up to 450. At 300, there's a skull and crossbones painted on it. And remember, he's been given a 60-volt shock and knows that hurts. They had 40 they first of all, they brought in their student base. They measured them as subjects, and he picked what he felt were the 40th healthiest, psychologically healthiest students in the group, and those are the ones he used. The measurement was how far would the teacher continue to administer shocks? Now, what's happening here is behind the scenes, the student is part of the experiment. He's part of the team. He can't see him once he's taken out of the room, and all the responses he gets are pre-written into the system, and he's hearing a recording of the student. All right, so the student will yell, "Ow!" The student, stop that. The student will yell at a certain point. The student is screaming, "Stop that!" At a certain point, the student is crying. After 300 volts, the student stops responding. So the potential is he's killed him. All the professor does throughout this, the only influence the professor, he has a series of 4 statements that he continues. And by the way, the subject has been told you'll be paid no matter what. All the professor says is the experiment requires you to continue. Please continue. We need you to continue. He's not saying anything threatening in process. Nobody stopped before 300 volts. Nobody, not one of the 40, and 85% went all the way to the end thinking that they had already killed him at 300 volts and continued. They were the subjects, the ones pushing the buttons to administer the shocks, were crying and pleading to be let out, even though no one had ever said to him, "You can't leave." 2 of the people who were subjects in this experiment subsequently killed themselves. This experiment became the basis for a lot of the ethics committees that arose, and therefore in America was never allowed to happen again, but it's been done cross-culturally, and the results are the same. And so again, Milgram began with the premise, nobody's going to do this. And what he found is, given the right setting, given the right authority figure, given a cause that you believe is a good cause, education, who could not want education, that the normal, healthy people will do things, that the situation is more powerful than the individual's personality and ethical standing. The reason I tell you this story, and I tell it to teens as well, is the only way to avoid this is to be aware that you're capable of doing this. If you think, "I wouldn't do it," I gotcha. You think your ethics alone will prevent you from doing this, that makes you vulnerable. You've got to walk around with antennas. You've got to walk around with an awareness of you can be duped. And as I said to you, it's been done cross-culturally, and the numbers are identical across the world. We want to believe that the Germans were somehow different from us, and therefore they were authority bent, and therefore they did something we wouldn't do. But the experiment, at least for what it's worth, and it's been, as I said to you, it's been replicated, indicates it's probably not the case. Now I want to hear responses. How upsetting is that?
Well, I'm terribly depressed. Thank you, Cantor.
Well, yeah, it's funny, when I teach a course on social psychology, I start the class, and I've done this with teens a few times, and I start the class and I say, how many of you think that you make your own decisions, that society's not making the decisions for you? All the hands go up in the class. By the time I finish the class, there's maybe one hand that sort of tentatively is sort of making its way up, right? There's a lot of ways in which this plays out in society. Look, we learn the rules of society, but nobody, I use this example all the time. You do not have the right to decide, I think green means stop and red means go. Now, that's not laden with ethics. But the reality of it is, you're not making all the decisions, particularly as a teenager, you're not making the decision. How many of us eat dog? They do in other countries. Okay. Somehow that's gross and disgusting. I'm looking at my dog and I'm not thinking Shabbos dinner.
Hmm.
Okay. And so, but that's culturally driven into us. We're not in control of as many decisions as we think. And so in order to be overcome this sort of power or even conformity kinds of issues, because there are parallel experiments in the area of conformity as well, you've got to walk through life with your antennas up. Otherwise, you're vulnerable. You're invulnerable to what society dictates, and what society tells you is right and wrong. It's very easy to fall into that.
Somehow, as you were going through the description, what I thought of was all of these huge protests at the Ivy League universities, especially. And I'm not quite sure how it fits, but it has to fit in terms of what they're doing and, some of the things you described, because the protests are grossly anti-Semitic, something
All right.
that you never even think about at a Harvard or a Yale or Dartmouth, for example.
Okay, I'm now we're talking conformity, and I can't help it. I love psychology, and I'm going to play. Okay, what enables that to happen? So another experiment was done by a scientist by the name of Ash, and he had people come into a room, and a whole room full is 12 people sitting around a room, and he put on a board something like this: two different things. Which one is larger? It was the question. You're sitting in the room, and the 11 people around you say, this is larger. Your choices are to say, what's wrong with you people? The question is, do you trust your judgment enough to go against the group?
Mhm.
It's called groupthink in the business world. Okay. And so what they found is most people do not have the courage or the belief that the trust in their own senses. I think that's a better way of saying it. The trust in their own senses. Now I'm giving you something that's extreme examples. If it were closer in size, all the more so. If I cut this in half and now I do this, it's a little less obvious, and therefore it becomes even worse. And most things in life are less obvious than that. Okay. Now you take a social cause like it's happening on the campuses, and everyone around you is saying, the Jews are bad, the Jews are bad, the Jews are bad, the Jews are bad, Israel bad, 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 bad. And you've got to stand up and say white, not yellow,
Mhm.
in the face of everyone else saying yellow. Doesn't happen very often. Even when it's obvious, even when it's obvious. So how does it happen on campus? That's how it happens on campus.
Well, when the Germans were doing this, you better stick with the majority, because otherwise, not only will you be, even if you're right, and some people secretly did things, they were the
Righteous Gentiles.
who hid it,
Right.
yeah, but in Germany, you would get killed
Right. So on
if you
top of
didn't
everything
vote
else,
with the majority.
right. So on top of everything else, in those situations, none of the ones I've described is there any physical punishment a threat,
Yeah.
any experiments. Now you've got it there, as you just pointed out, it's you've got that on top of it. And not only are they going to kill you, they may kill your family.
Mhm.
It's not, yeah, Sandy.
Okay, another aspect of what's happening on campus, well, there's multiple aspects, including the freshman who believes that history started when he or she first took the freshman history course. And if there's a lot of people who are taught in the oppressed oppressor, and you're bombarded on TV with pictures of what's happening to the Gazan, the civilian Palestinian population. I, as a very strong supporter of Israel, am anguished to see that.
Right.
Why
Right.
are they not protesting what's happening to the Uyghurs? Why are
To
they
the
not
who?
to the Uyghurs in the Muslims in China? You can list 20 things that are going on, including that oppressing blacks one group is oppressing another black group in Africa. You're not seeing it on TV.
Right, right.
And that has a major difference as to what you're seeing and not seeing. And then once you get two things, intersectionality, where if you want to be a social justice person, then you've got to check all these boxes or you can't be a social justice person.
Right.
If you're a Zionist, then they won't let you volunteer to do that. Another is that people reach conclusions. This is not limited to this one issue. Certainly we see this in American politics. People reach a conclusion, and instead of letting the facts determine the conclusion, they let the conclusion determine the facts.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance. Yeah, so and our own choices further influence how we think as well in that process. Absolutely. Just a very quick example in the University of Houston, Hillel here in town had a gay and lesbian group. All right, that was part of it, and they were thrown out of the groups on campus that were pro-Israel. They were thrown out of the campus larger societies because they were pro-Israel. They wanted nothing to do with them.
Yeah, it happened at Rice for sure.
At Rice, right. I'm sorry, I thought it was you. All right. I want to do I just want to point out one more thing and then continue on if we want. There's also a book called Ordinary Men, written by Christopher Browning, who's not Jewish. I happened to have just this month gone on Netflix. There's a documentary of the same name with Christopher Browning doing the narrating of it. What he describes in this book is, we talked about last time, the Holocaust by bullets. In other words, before the camps were open, they went out and shot people in mass numbers. And what he's looking at is, how does somebody with a gun in their hand shoot somebody directly? I don't know this person. In the concentration camps, they were sort of individualized. You didn't know the people. They were just put in a big room and gassed. How do I walk up to somebody and shoot them? And what was the experience like? What were the people feeling? What were the consequences if they didn't? And I recommend certainly the documentary. It's on Netflix. It's an easy watch. It's a difficult watch, but it's an easy watch. And then I recommend the book as well. So there's two books. These both really have great value. This is about the Holocaust by bullets. This is about looking at Germans after the war and trying to understand how they stood by. Both have great value. So, you know, it's one thing to shoot somebody anonymously. It's another to look them in the eye and harm them. It's far more difficult.
It's also easier to drop a bomb than to shoot someone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you hear that from the people who dropped the atomic bomb.
Mhm.
Right? Yeah. All right. So I guess what I want, I'm going to repeat really the element of this. It's about analyzing how it happened in Germany, how it happened in Russia, that people stood by when the shootings were happening. But I think its application to modern society has great value, and to walk away from just as a historical lens and not see that history repeats itself and that human beings behave consistently despite what we want to believe is we are a far more ethical people ain't necessarily so. We've got to walk around with antennas and be aware. And be aware of what you read in the paper and how it's impacting you. How when you watch the news, how it's impacting you. And as a result, what would you tolerate? I don't know how to top that as a message, so I'm going to sort of leave it there for this week. But I think it really is probably, if I were to say to you out of this entire course, what's the most important thing I communicate, that was it.
And that kind of thing relates to what I had brought up before on what's going on when the creme de la creme, in quotes, of our colleges and how that relates to us. And,
Mhm.
it's something we think about. And, you put it on the TV or whatever, newspaper, and it definitely relates directly, I know, to us.
It
Well,
does. Yeah, look at the Ukraine.
Mhm.
It's fallen off the papers.
Look at
Israel-
Texas.
Right. It's right. Israel has knocked the Ukraine off of the papers in terms of atrocities that are going on. Number
Mhm.
one, the reality of it is, I don't know why, but the news agencies have probably a ratio of 20-1 that they station in Jerusalem relative to any other city in the world. And so they're just waiting for something to happen. But the reality of it is, and here's a case, by the way, the Ukrainians have not been terribly good to Jews throughout history.
Yeah.
This is a case where we're supporting them, but in many ways it's choosing the lesser of two evils.
the
Sounds like
bigger-
communism and Nazism.
Right, the bigger mumser.
Yeah.
Also,
It's-
that there's a Jewish leader of
There's a-
Ukraine,
Right.
which is
So we
pretty
feel,
strange.
right, we feel better about that on some level, but
Yes.
we also know the tentative nature of it,
Mhm.
right? History has taught us that for sure. Jerry?
well, not to be political, but if you look at the Republicans and Trump,
Okay.
who says, I won the election, period, and no changes. Look at how many agree with him. It's like looking at the big square, the big rectangle and the little rectangle, saying the little one is the larger one.
Right. And what keeps just going forward, and I'm going to try and take it out of the parties. A lot of what Trump did, what keeps the Democrats from doing that in the future too? Once it's become normalized or accepted, it's no longer just one party that could do that. Right now, it's a good political stance to say, I'm against that. 20 years from now, this precedent's been set, and that's very dangerous, no matter which party you're on. Gary. And so I tried to take the Trump piece out of it if I could.
Well, one of the
I-
problems, okay,
right,
to be
right.
more, not political, but more political, our country's government is such that it only has developed to the point that there's only two parties. And it turns out that probably the parliamentary type governments where there are many parties would be better.
Really? Have you seen how Israel operates?
Yeah.
It's an extreme where if you have one vote, well, you don't get a seat anymore. But initially, that's what happened.
Right.
So you
right,
need,
but look at Israel, where all the power resides in the small parties.
because they're the make the margins.
Right, the coalitions. Right. So I'm not going to suggest that one is better than the other. Let me suggest both have real problems, and I'm not sure anybody's come up with a solution. But at least I would say to you, we're voting. It's worse when there's no vote. All right. Yeah.
In what country in the Middle East have Palestinians had the greatest right to vote in the last 15 years?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. Where are they being tolerated to exist?
And they exist very well. There's a lot of Israeli Arabs, Israeli Muslims that are against the Palestinians who are doing well.
I'm not here to talk about how we resolve that because I'm completely at a loss on how to solve it. I'm praying there are minds far greater than mine out there. But it is hard, as Sandy said, to watch the suffering. No, we don't want anyone to suffer at the end of the day. I understand there are needs and we need to guarantee our security. But I hear Golda Meir in the background saying, I hate the Arabs because they forced my kids to learn to kill.
Hmm.
Or it was a version I heard was, I can forgive them for what they did to our boys. I can't forgive them for what they made our boys
Right.
do to them. Or when Palestinian mothers start loving their children,
Loving the
that they hate Jews, we'll have peace.
Paraphrasing, you're 100%. That is the phrase. All right. The human suffering is intolerable. As Jews, we know that we need to stand up when people are suffering. I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. And then you top all that off with a Netanyahu and all that he brings to the table and what his motivations, his private motivations may be, and the whole thing is one big mess. This is not the way I wanted to end this class. I wanted to end this class on a more positive of go out into the world, be aware, see, notice, take note, be responsible, because we learn from history. Nonetheless,
Hopefully.
we've ended on a negative, really negative place. All right, so the next 2 weeks, there is no class. I've got 2 Sundays in a row. This week is Yom Limmud. So if you've not signed up for Yom Limmud, it's a community learning day. Please consider doing so. The following week, I'm away on a retreat we have with our conversion candidates. And so we'll resume in 3 weeks. Okay. It's been a pleasure. I love the wisdom that comes out of this class, and I love learning from you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye,
bye.
everybody.